here the intelligence data for today's mission. This is mission 5102. Your call sign is Maple. Time over the target is 12:40. You will provide cover for 16 F-84 fighter bombers, call sign Gel, attacking rail lines west of Changju at 12:40. Other F-86 Sabres, call sign John, will cover 36 F-80 fighter bombers, call sign Midas, attacking the same target at 13:15. Your escape and evasion procedures remain the same. We have a large and a small helicopter at each of these two islands, and an Albatross flying boat will be orbiting over this island. If you should run into any trouble in the target area, pull out over the water, and they will be there to pick you up. Stand by for a time hack. In 15 seconds, it will be 11:10.
With the arrival of a second USAF Sabre wing into the area, it was apparent that 77 Squadron's role would change. The air battle of the 1st of December, with the loss of 3 Meteors, demonstrated the superiority of the Russian jets, and that it would be foolish to continue using the Meteor on fighter sweeps up Mig Alley.
I didn't fly it when it was first issued to 77 Squadron. It was when it went into aerial combat at altitude, say 35,000 feet up on the Yalu, where they mixed it with the MiGs. They took a pounding up there, really. We lost a couple of good fellas there and had a lot of aircraft shot down. Not going to say a lot, but quite a few shot down. 1 or 2 bailed out, taken prisoners of war. But it was not a good competitive high-altitude fighter compared to a MiG. So for that reason, the MiG could outturn a Meteor. It was faster, even though it didn't have the armour plating on it that other aircraft had. In some cases, they didn't have radio, I believe. But the Meteor didn't compare to a MiG at high altitude as a pure interceptor fighter. But the Meteor was restricted after we took a few losses, and it was proved that it wasn't as good as the MiG, and it was restricted to ground attack. And it was an excellent rocket platform. You could carry 16 60-pound rockets on a Meteor. And it had 4 Oerlikon 20mm cannons on it, which was good also in ground attack. So all the time I was there, the 49 missions I did, most of them were in ground attack and with rockets, napalm and high explosive. Not often do we have to use the guns. We'd finished truck strafing, road strafing, locomotive strafing. There wasn't much left on the ground to shoot at there in that respect with cannon, but there was still plenty to rocket in the way of army installations and assembly areas and all that sort of thing. So the intentions were good with the Meteor, but it didn't live up to its expectations at altitude as an interceptor fighter. Well, as I said, it was a good platform. It was twin engine, which gave it more reliability, and in ground attack you'd take a hell of a lot of shell fire and small arms fire and all that sort of thing, and it'd take a bit of battle damage, the Meteor would too, but it was a stable aircraft, and for that reason you had time to sight up for rocket attacks, gun attacks and all that sort of thing without the aircraft wandering around all over the sky. As I said, it was a good stable platform. It was fast enough for that sort of thing, and in a dive and out of the dive you could get away pretty quickly. but it would have been used at high altitude right through the war if it had just been that little bit better, that's all, but it wasn't as good as the MiG.
In January 1952, the squadron was assigned the role of area and airfield defence for both Kimpo and Suwon, leaving the Sabres to patrol the skies over North Korea. In a ground attack role, the Meteor was able to find its niche in the Korean conflict. The squadron flew its first ground attack sortie on the 8th of January when 4 Meteors rocketed a water tower near a communist-held town. Ground attack missions required the Meteors to operate over hostile territory at low level. On the 27th of January, the squadron lost 2 pilots within an hour of each other as their Meteors attacked enemy positions in the Haeju area. In atrocious snowy conditions, Flight Lieutenant Mark Brown Gaylord was hit by light flak of a strafing run, which knocked out his airspeed indicator and altimeter. The leader, Flight Lieutenant William Bennett, tried to inform Brown Gaylord of his correct height, but received no reply, and it is assumed that he crashed into the rugged terrain. Less than an hour later, Sergeant Bruce Gillen was hit by flak in the starboard wing while strafing an enemy water tower. Gillen probably ejected from his crippled jet, although no parachute was seen by his wingman, and it remains a mystery as to how he met his death. Accurate enemy anti-aircraft fire was becoming a major problem for the squadron pilots. On the 6th of February, anti-aircraft fire claimed another Meteor flown by Flight Lieutenant John Hannon. A large search was launched as Hannon had been seen to parachute safely to the ground. On landing into white snow, he became invisible to the pilots overhead. Hannon was captured by the North Koreans and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. One of the searching pilots, Flying Officer Richard Whitman, had a lucky escape when an enemy .25 caliber bullet passed through the aircraft seat without touching him. Another pilot, Sergeant Philip Zupp, was also called into the search. In the heavily defended area, Zupp made several low passes looking for Hannon when he thought that he'd caught a glimpse of a pilot's red marker scarf on the snow. He circled his Meteor around at treetop height to investigate. His next memory was a deafening roar as his cockpit seemed to explode around him. With his canopy in pieces, the freezing 300-knot airflow startled him into evasive action. He heaved back on the control column as his Meteor's ventral tank was now perilously close to the ground. Struggling to regain his orientation, he reached to straighten his oxygen mask and shattered goggles, his face now stinging from embedded perspex and shrapnel. He managed to nurse his Meteor back to Kimpo, where he was treated for his wounds. Leaving the hospital later that day of his own volition, he was to fly 2 sorties the following morning. 10 days later, Sergeant Richard Robinson, who was flying his 38th mission with the squadron, crashed as a result of enemy ground fire whilst on a rocket mission. The Meteor crashed without him being seen to eject. Late in 1951, the RAAF developed a new type of air-to-ground rocket containing napalm. It was known as the Flaming Onion. After trials at Williamtown and preliminary testing in Korea, the first weapons arrived in February 1952. The weapon was first put to the test on the 8th of February when the squadron's new CO, Wing Commander Ron Susans, led 4 Meteors armed with the new rocket in an attack on several buildings. The result was that 75% of the rockets scored hits on the targets, resulting in numerous fires. The new weapon was to prove extremely useful against enemy vehicle convoys and troop concentrations, and it soon became the standard underwing weapon carried by RAAF Meteors. Each aircraft was capable of carrying 8 napalm rockets. During the next few months, the squadron continued to fly demanding ground attack missions as well as area defense patrols. Unfortunately, 2 more pilots were lost during March. Sergeant Ian Cranston and Sergeant Lionel Cowper. Both failed to return from ground attack sorties. An indication of how hectic March was is shown in the squadron's operation sheets as 1,007 individual sorties were flown. On the 13th of April, Easter Sunday, Sergeant Max Colebrook was hit by enemy fire while strafing a suspected gun position. He radioed he was okay after jettisoning his ventral tank and was heading for home, but nothing more was heard or seen of him. On the 22nd of April 1952, Flight Lieutenant Ian Percy was hit by intense and accurate light automatic fire during a ground attack mission, and although the ejection seat was seen to leave the aircraft, nothing was seen of the parachute, and the aircraft crashed into the water south of the town of Chinampo. The communist ground forces soon began to feel the effects of the continuous attacks on their supply lines. By early May, they began to send MiGs south in the hope of intercepting the raiders before they could reach their targets, so once more, the Meteors were to clash with the MiGs. On the 4th of May 1952, a patrol of 2 Meteors sighted a flight of 9 MiG-15s southwest of Pyongyang. The MiGs immediately launched an attack, but on this occasion, the odds lay with the Meteors as the MiGs were forced to fight at low altitude, thus negating their high-altitude performance advantage. A MiG latched itself onto Sergeant Edward Meyer's tail, but was quickly shaken off, enabling his number 2, Pilot Officer John Sermon, to fire 2 bursts of cannon fire into the MiG. The starboard tailplane and the starboard side of the MiG's exhaust port were seen to disintegrate in a flash of flame. Sermon was credited with probably having destroyed the aircraft, as neither Australian saw the MiG impact the ground. 4 days later, in the same area, a flight of 4 Meteors were intercepted by 2 MiGs. Once again, the Meteors had a height advantage. This enabled Pilot Officer Bill Simmonds to make a firing pass on one of the enemy jets. The MiG entered an uncontrollable spin, and the pilot was seen to bail out. This was the squadron's 9th MiG claim.
Our formation was flying probably several thousand feet below the Americans, and the first indication I had of any real danger was when I observed 3 distinct lines of tracer ammunition going over my left wing. Instinctively, I pulled away from these bullets, and by simply just going into a hard right turn. I'd hardly begun the turn when I observed a MiG-15 fly straight underneath me. My immediate impression was that this was too good an opportunity to miss, so I reversed and started to follow him, and I accelerated at the same time. When he was probably a couple of hundred yards in front, I started firing, and he was still, although I was accelerating, he was still moving away from me. But finally, some of the bullets obviously hit his aircraft because there was a large plume of smoke was emitted from around the fuselage area. And the next thing I saw was this aircraft sort of pitch up, obviously out of control. And as I was aware that there were other MiGs in the area, I rolled to the left and started into a hard turn, just to ensure that there was nobody behind me. And as I went into the turn, the flight leader observed the pilot of the MiG to bail out. He ejected, and his parachute deployed, and presumably he landed safely. Meanwhile, our section of 4 aircraft regrouped, and we continued flying there for another 10 or 15 minutes before we redeployed or flew back to the base. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds, but that's the nature of air combat these days. Sort of long, sort of drawn out dogfighting is something that was sort of relegated to World War II, really, with jet aircraft using so much fuel. Unless it's you've got to get into it and out of it in a hurry, otherwise you won't have enough fuel to get home.
The squadron continued to suffer great losses, with Pilot Officer Donald Robertson lost on the 15th of May whilst on a rocket mission. It was believed that the aircraft was hit by enemy ground fire whilst in a dive and exploded on contact with the ground. In July, Sergeant Kenneth Smith struck a small hill after making a strafing run whilst on an armed reconnaissance mission. His aircraft was seen to burst into flames and disintegrate. The following month, Flight Lieutenant Lance Haslope was also killed in a crash during takeoff on a rocket mission. On the afternoon of the 1st of September, 2 Meteors departed in formation from Iwakuni, en route for K-14 in Korea, on a ferry flight. The aircraft became separated in heavy turbulent cloud, both being thrown out of control. One crashed off the Japanese coast, killing both pilot officer Alan Avery and squadron engineer Flight Lieutenant Henry Johnston. The other Meteor, flown by flying officer Randall Green, returned to Iwakuni severely damaged by hail and turbulence. Then, a month later, on the 2nd of October, flying officer Oliver Cruikshank, a RAF exchange pilot, was shot down in a surprise attack. A flight of 4 Meteors had carried out a successful rocket strike and were returning to Kimpo when 2 MiGs jumped them from the 8 o'clock position. Sergeant Ken Murray received a 37mm hit in the port tailpipe during the MiG's first pass. He later observed Cruikshank bailing out over Chodot. Unfortunately, Cruikshank's parachute failed to open, and he fell into the sea with no chance of survival. The squadron returned to the fighter sweep role on the 13th of October, 1952, to set a record for any fighter unit of its size operating in Korea. The squadron flew a total of 80 sorties in one day, with only 22 serviceable aircraft. At this time, with the onset of the Korean winter, the squadron's maintenance personnel once again found their task increasingly more difficult. Sub-zero temperatures meant that fitters had to work with their gloves on at all times, as removing them for more than a few moments would invariably lead to frostbite. This made delicate operations all but impossible. Flight Lieutenant Frederick Lawrenson was hit by ground fire on the 24th of December, resulting in his starboard wing exploding and the aircraft crashing. He was not seen to eject. At the beginning of the new year, there was a change of leadership, with Wing Commander Jack Kininmont handing command to Wing Commander John Hubble on the 20th of January, 1953. Flying during the month was disrupted by continual bad weather, although a few successful strikes were carried out, with 50 enemy trucks and 48 buildings destroyed. The squadron lost 1 pilot during this month of atrocious weather. RAF pilot Flying Officer Francis Booth, who failed to return from an attack on 2 trains hidden in railway tunnels. Losses continued, with Flight Sergeant John Halley failing to return from an armed reconnaissance mission on the 11th of February and was posted missing, believed killed. Less than a month later, squadron leader Don Hillier failed to return from an armed reconnaissance mission, and although extensive searches were carried out by other pilots, no trace of his aircraft or parachute could be found. Among the tragic stories of loss were also moments the pilots could look back at and laugh about. Here's Colin King recounting such an incident.
On the 6th of March, it's a terrible story. I suppose it would have been about my 4th or 5th mission. And I was flying with a fellow by the name of Bill Percy, flight lieutenant, who was killed a few months later. Very nice chap. We were called upon, probably at fairly short notice, to attack a gaggle of trucks, a column of trucks. I can't remember why, there were just the 2 of us were sent out, but it was late in the day, and I can only think that all the others were out already, or were home and finished, or to take too long to get hold of it. They were able to get hold of us for some reason, and they told us where these trucks were and told us to get out and get them. Now, Bill Percy knew where they were, fortunately. Not quite sure why, but he did tell me, I know exactly where they are, Cole, let's go. We took off, and I was formating on him down sun. So I'm looking up into the sun, and the glare was terrible, so I took out my dark glasses and put them on. That was much better. When we found our target, it was 7:30 at night, and it was getting fairly duskish. And we were attacking in a valley, and there was a lot of flak because what we were attacking were trucks full of troops. And they were scattering it was like hitting an ant heap. They were scattering everywhere. And of course they were all firing at us also. It was blink, blink, blink everywhere. There was also tracer there. There was also heavy armament there. And we were doing good high speed, probably the 600, 650 mile an hour. And we're well spaced because if we went too close behind one another, we could ricochets at least could shoot the other fellow down. And we were both having successful hits on these trucks. But I was alarmed at the fact that here we are strafing at night. It was quite dark. And also I was not terribly used to this sort of thing, and I probably came in a little bit steeper than I should have. When I pulled out, the aircraft kept going because of the momentum, and this happened to quite a few people. And by the time I actually pulled out, I was looking up at telegraph poles. That's how low I was. And finally, we both got hit, not badly, but we were hit a bit. We didn't know at the time that we got back. And finally, we knocked off for want of fuel, or maybe we're out of ammunition, but we knocked off and headed home. And now it was really dark, and I started to wonder why I couldn't see the instruments very well. Mind you, I hadn't done a night landing in a Meteor before, and I turned up the lights, and gee whiz, it was dark. And I could just see Bill Percy, and the exhaust stubs of his engines and so forth. And then he put on his lights when we got near base, and I could see the tail light, a crucifix tail. There's a light in the centre of that at the back. And I followed that around the circuit, and I was very grateful for it because I couldn't see the runway lighting because it was terribly dim, being an airport, a war airport, and they shrouded the lights. You could really only see them properly when you're on the final approach. I followed him round, and no, I got down all right, no problem. But it seemed to me like a pretty dicey exercise, and first night landing in a Meteor, I thought, oh, gee whiz, I wouldn't want to do too much of this in bad weather. And we walked across the tarmac to talk to Bill. He said, "Kingy, do you always fly at night with your dark glasses on?" And that was a very embarrassing moment. I said, well, thank goodness they don't issue Klotz medals in this squadron.
On the 16th of March, the squadron carried out what was arguably its most successful mission of the Korean War, having destroyed an enemy convoy of approximately 150 trucks. The convoy was first disabled at both ends, preventing any escape. The Meteors then ran up and down the convoy length, rocketing and strafing. Realizing the enormity of the job at hand, the squadron requested USAF assistance. After 6 hours, the convoy was left in tatters. 77 Squadron alone accounted for the destruction of at least 24 vehicles and damage to an additional 74. The Meteors also strafed 35 troop billets, 10 supply stacks, and 2 buildings. A message of congratulations was received from the commanding general Far East Air Forces, and as a result, the morale of the squadron soared to new heights. However, 10 days later, Sergeant Peter Chalmers lost his life when his aircraft was hit by ground fire and was seen to crash and explode after an attack on a truck. The next day, a flight of 4 Meteors on an armed reconnaissance mission spotted a MiG chasing 2 USAF F-80 Shooting Star jets. 2 more MiGs appeared as the Meteors approached. In the engagement, Sergeant Dave Earlham received a major hit and had to break contact to nurse his jet back to Kimpo. Meanwhile, Sergeant George Hale fired a high-explosive air-to-ground rocket between the 2 MiGs before engaging them with his cannons. Hale was credited with having probably shot down one of the MiGs, damaging another, and definitely scaring the daylights out of the 2 Chinese pilots. The next day, Flying Officer Taffy Rosser, RAF, lost contact after an attack on camouflage trucks. The remaining pilots circled the area but could not see any sign of Rosser or his aircraft. At this time, Sergeant Ken Murray was posted back to Australia, having set a record by flying a total of 333 sorties during his 2 tours with the squadron. During the spring of 1953, 77 Squadron began night-armed reconnaissance missions with a good deal of success. Coming into the wet season and adverse weather conditions saw sorties decline, and in June the squadron lost another pilot, Sergeant Desmond Nolan. The slowdown of activity did not last long. On the 15th of June, the squadron broke their own sortie record by flying 88 sorties in the one day over 90 hours and 5 minutes of flying time. Most of this effort was expended on enemy troop concentrations, with 224 rockets being fired, destroying numerous vehicles, revetments, and an enemy command post. The only 77 Squadron casualty sustained during the raid was Sergeant Don Pinkstone, who was hit by anti-aircraft fire when attacking an enemy vehicle and was forced to bail out of his stricken jet. He parachuted safely, landing successfully in a nearby rice paddy. Other members of his flight saw Pinkstone fold up his parachute and run for the cover of some high ground near a small village. A rescue helicopter was called in, but was forced away from the downed pilot by intense enemy ground fire, leaving Pinkstone to be captured and interned as a prisoner of war. The 22nd of June 1953 saw another successful ejection when RAF flying officer John Coleman was hit by ground fire, but managed to bring the aircraft back to friendly lines and bailed out at 15,000 feet, later to be picked up by helicopter.
We had one Brit while I was still there, Coleman. He had to bail out. He got hit in the side somewhere, and it jammed his controls just north of the line. He bailed out, and the helicopters got him, and he was back not long after we sort of got out of the cockpit. And there were blokes who'd bailed out in the water, still on the wing, and the choppers would pick them up because they had some islands on the coast where they based the rescue helicopters. One of the missions we used to do, in fact, was capping combat air patrol, called capping. We would fly above a bloke who'd crashed or bailed out, and if any troops came near him, we would attack them. Of course, we were getting shot at while we were up there, but you did as much as was a reasonable risk to rescue your pilots. They're very valuable assets.
Squadron leader Len McGlinchey was killed on the 16th of July when his aircraft crashed and burned on takeoff. He had been detailed to participate in a rocket strike over North Korea. The war on the ground had stagnated into a stalemate, with neither side being able to gain the upper hand. The UN air forces had definite air superiority, but this alone could not win the war. An armistice signed at Panmunjom at 10:01 hours on the 27th of July 1953 brought hostilities to a halt, with a ceasefire commencing shortly afterwards. The contribution made by 77 Squadron during the 3 years of the Korean War is totally out of proportion to that which might be expected from a unit of its size. During the war, the squadron flew a total of 18,872 sorties, comprising of 3,872 Mustang and 15,000 Meteor flights. The squadron lost 41 personnel killed, including RAF pilots, all but 2 being due to an aircraft-related incident, and 7 pilots captured. The squadron was credited with destroying 3,700 buildings, 1,500 vehicles, 16 bridges, 20 locomotives, 65 railway carriages, and an unknown number of enemy personnel. The outstanding results achieved by 77 Squadron, evidently much higher than usual for a single squadron, would not have been possible without the support provided by 391 Base Squadron and 491 Maintenance Squadron. The level of technical support was outstanding, resulting in close to 100% serviceability for the Mustangs and Meteors. To achieve this, maintenance crews often worked up to 16 hours per day under extremely harsh and often wet conditions. After the armistice agreement was signed, 77 Squadron stayed on in Korea, helping to maintain the United Nations presence.